happy to welcome you to our symposium, Beyond Longevity, Achieving Wellbeing and Healthy Aging. And this is our two-day symposium that's hosted by the Cheung Center for Health and Happiness. This is actually our second of the two programs. If you're interested, we'll have the first program was also recorded and you can get to that. Today's program is going to focus on the psychological assets that support healthy aging. We are, as I said, continuing a conversation that we started on October 21st when we focused on social assets that support healthy aging. So we're sort of running the gamut between social and psychological factors that make it possible to age in good health. Over the course of the event, we're going to have our expert speakers who will be discussing important work on aging from a positive health perspective. And this includes our current understanding of the social and environmental factors that are likely to support healthy aging, the roles that happiness, other facets of positive psychological well-being and mental health might play in physical health and longevity, and talk about potential interventions and policy approaches to helping people to age in good health, and put together some ideas for a future research agenda. So as many of you may know, or those who are less familiar with us, the mission of the Cheung Center for Health and Happiness is to build a rigorous and interdisciplinary science of positive health and well-being, and to translate that science to influence practice and policy. So our goal is to achieve a transformation, which is very, very modest goal, to achieve a transformation where we don't only think about deficit and problems, to understanding well-being in the broader sense, so that we also think about assets and resources that can help us to maintain and promote better health. Just like the World Health Organization, the center understands health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and can't be measured simply by the absence of disease or infirmity. We probably all know people who are not sick but don't still seem like they're doing all that well. And, you know, we're really interested in the full continuum and range of health, from, you know, folks who are not doing well at all to folks who are doing really, really well, in hopes that understanding what enables people to function well, or even to, you know, to do really well, will help shed light on ways to make the population healthier overall, and also to help folks who might be struggling. So I want to be sure that we acknowledge and thank the Lee family for their generous support of the center, without which this would not be possible. I also want to thank the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies that's co-hosted this event with us. And we are going to begin the event with a keynote address from Dr. Laura Carstensen, who is the founding director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. After the keynote, Dr. Anthony Ong from Cornell University and Dr. Robert Waldinger from Harvard Medical School will join Dr. Carstensen in the Zoom way for a panel discussion that will be moderated by Dr. Vish Biswanath and Dr. Lilian from Harvard Cheung. Of course, during the program, if you have any questions for our speakers, type them into the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box, and we can make those questions possible. And now what I want to do is to go ahead and introduce Dr. Laura Carstensen so we can get started. She is professor of psychology and the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Junior Professor in Public Policy at Stanford University, where she serves as founding director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. And I want to say that when the Cheung Center was launched, we were big admirers of the Stanford Center that Dr. Carstensen is the head of, and have looked to it quite a bit for as a model for a way to be a good center. So we appreciate that. Dr. Carstensen's research has been supported continuously by the National Institute on Aging for over 25 years. She is currently supported through a prestigious merit award. She's written the book, A Long Bright Future, Happiness, Health, and Financial Security in an Age of Increased Longevity. She's served on the National Advisory Council on Aging. She's been on the MacArthur Foundation's Research Network for an Aging Society. In 2016, she was inducted into the National Academy of Medicine. She's won too many awards to mention, and so forth. So we are really thrilled to have her with us today. And we thank you for joining us, Dr. Carstensen, and give you good welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is such a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here. with all of you today, and I'm especially delighted because of the panel that I get to talk to Anthony Ong and Bob Waldinger. I mean, that, you know, I'll jump at a chance to do that any day. So it's especially nice to be here, and I thank all of you for spending this time with us today. I'm going to share my screen. I hope, one never knows. Here. There we go. I see it. If you all see it, good to go. Okay. What I want to talk about today is what I've come to call the misery myth. This idea that aging is associated with loneliness, despair, anxiety, and depression. It is a view that continues to be the backdrop for many conversations about aging and aging populations. I think it's wrong, so thus the misery myth. When I look at back on my career, I'm trying to, I think of my experience in the field of aging as exciting, largely because we've discovered that so many presumptions we had about aging are wrong. And there are two reasons for this. I mean, one is that we were just wrong about some of fundamental views of aging. But some also is because aging is a moving target. It's changing over historical time. So cohorts of older people today are healthier than cohorts 20 and 30 years ago. We've learned that dementia is not an inevitable part of aging. And in fact, we've also recognized that we've been exaggerating cognitive decline over time because we've been conflating people in very early stages of disease, maybe even pre-symptomatic disease, with healthy people. We've discovered that crystallized intelligence has been underestimated, in part because of the way that we measure it, and that expertise continues to increase. But there's one key myth, and I mentioned this before. I call this the misery myth, and I think this one continues to persist. When I was in graduate school, it was textbook knowledge. I mean, literally in textbooks, it was written that older people experienced, the majority of older people experienced psychopathology, usually in the form of depression and anxiety, but that psychopathology increased with age. And of course, this made logical sense because if you're coming to the end of your life, the presumption was people would be despairing. But then as we began to really study aging empirically and to collect data, we repeatedly found evidence that older people were doing well. In fact, not just okay, but they were doing, emotionally speaking, better than middle-aged and younger adults. Now, if this surprises you, know that you're not alone. This surprised the scientific community greatly. It certainly surprised me early on in my career. I was trying to study the misery associated with social isolation, and just kept finding that the majority of people were actually doing quite well. Now, it became the most scrutinized finding in the field over time because people just didn't believe it. You know, the psychoanalysts talked about mass depression. People said that this must be denial. Another explanation was related to cognitive decline. I sort of call this, I shouldn't say this when I'm being recorded and I'm on Zoom, but the village idiot approach is sort of like people just can't hold on to those despairing, awful beliefs long enough to really get into a healthy rumination about it. And so that's why people were happier, because positive emotions are just simpler and easier to process than negative emotions. And then probably most recently, there has been a perspective that older people do better because they avoid stress, that their lives are less stressful, they're retired, they can control their worlds better. And so what they do is to avoid stress. avoid stressful situations. But if they were exposed to prolonged, inescapable, stressful situations, they would decline precipitously. That's been kind of the model. And by the way, there's a lot of reason to think that this is a reasonable perspective. There's a lot of evidence for what emotion researchers would call antecedent emotion regulation. We select environments and people and projects that are familiar and that we know will be relatively positive. So in my laboratory, when COVID appeared, we thought, well, this is a prolonged, inescapable stressor, and it's affecting older people more than any other age group. So let's look now and see how older people are faring relative to younger people. These would be the conditions where you would expect older people to do worse. What we found in a large national representative sample was that older people were reporting fewer negative emotions during this time and more positive emotions. And we generally don't find an increase in positive emotions in our work, although some people do. But most of the evidence we see for these improvements in well-being have to do with a decline in negative. But in this particular study, we also saw this increase in positive. These effects of improved emotional experience have been shown in using multiple methods and multiple laboratories. Art Stone and his colleagues have conducted Gallup polls repeatedly over time, where they simply ask people, how much stress did you experience yesterday? They regularly find that older people report less stress. How much worry? We regularly see this pattern where older people are reporting less worry the day before than younger people. Anger declines. Essentially, across these negative emotions, we see reports of less negative emotion over time. Now, in my group and many others, we were thinking that since most of this research is cross-sectional, what we could be seeing are just generational differences, not age differences in emotional experience. That is, maybe the greatest generation is and always was the greatest generations, but we wouldn't expect to see that longitudinally going forward. And so my group conducted an experience sampling study, initially a cross-sectional study, and then followed those people for a decade, repeatedly sampling emotions in a burst design at intervals of a week in duration over time, so that we were able to see if these same kinds of patterns appeared within individuals over time. And we do see evidence for this in this longitudinal study as well. Now, what you see here is a little different. What you see in this figure is positive emotion minus negative. And so the higher the line, the more positive on balance one is feeling. This is curve fitting, so it looks like you see a little decline there, but what the actual finding is that we see pretty substantial increase in emotional balance, emotional experience in everyday life until around 70, and then it levels, and we don't really see much of a decline. Some researchers have found a decline after 70 or 80. When they control for time left in life, they eliminate most of that decline after that. So it looks like if you're coming to the end of your life, people are not as emotionally positive as when they're not coming to the end of their life. But if people are 90, let's say you've got a 90-year-old who's going to live to be 100, 90 does not predict anything negative about emotional experience. But of course, the older people get, the more likely they are to be coming to the end of their lives. Now, when we hear and read about the findings that we see in emotional aging, we hear a lot, and especially in the media, the headlines are about positive emotion. Older people are getting happier. And I think it's important to spend just a couple minutes considering this, because I don't believe there's much evidence for older people getting happier. And they're certainly not a happy-go-lucky group. That would be mischaracterizing the kind of experience that we're seeing in our research and others. You'll hear from Anthony Ong about this probably too, where we see more mixed emotional experience. In the longitudinal study where we used experience sampling, we computed the number of factors that people were experiencing emotionally, and then charted the number of factors by age, and we saw more complex emotions, so that when in any given sampling experience, when people were asked about how they were feeling, they were more likely than younger people to report multiple emotions, both positive and negative. So the complexity seemed to increase. Now, others have found this as well. Schneider and Stone, in two very large national studies, found the same kinds of reports from people, that older people were more likely to report positive and negative emotions at the same time. We think what's happening is that there is a richness of emotion that develops with age, and that part of the story, and I'll return to this momentarily, but that part of the story of emotion and aging is about how loss and fragility actually increases gratitude and appreciation. That it is very much the case that these mixed emotions are what are providing this rich and relatively positive emotional experience. Very quickly, in a nutshell, I'll describe a theory that my colleagues and I developed over the years that was aimed at explaining what had been called the paradox of aging. That is, how could people, when they do experience so much loss, continue to do well and maybe even better emotionally than younger people? Socio-emotional selectivity theory is really grounded in the human ability to monitor time and to appreciate their mortality for much of their lives. And because goals are always set in temporal context, as time runs out, people change the kinds of goals that they set. Selectivity theory postulates that when time horizons are long and nebulous, people are in a preparatory state. They're pursuing goals about learning, about taking risk, about generating new knowledge. And these are goals that almost inherently involve some negative emotion. It's hard to learn. It's repeated trials and errors. And then as time becomes more constrained, those goals shift to goals and ones that can be realized in the here and now. Those are goals generally about meaning in life, about living in the moment, seeing what's important, spending time on activities and with people who matter most to you. We spent a lot of time in my group studying ways in which time horizons can be expanded or constrained in ways that will eliminate age differences. So socio-emotional selectivity theory essentially, at its strongest view, says there are no age differences. Not age differences, there are time differences. And because if younger people are experiencing limitations on time, they too will show similar kinds of changes in goals. And we have, in a number of studies, experimentally manipulated time to show that preferences and goals then shift, and we find evidence that they do. And we've also studied natural occurrences that prime a sense of endings. 9/11, we expect COVID is doing this right now. Terrorism, political upheavals, illnesses in young people. In one study that we conducted years ago with young men who had the HIV virus, we saw very similar patterns as we did in older adults. So what we have come to believe is that time horizons matter a great deal to the goals that people pursue in everyday life and the kinds of experiences that subsequently come. Hal Hirschfield and I, years ago, used an imaging experimental paradigm in order to see whether we could induce a sense of poignancy in the laboratory. And we asked younger and older people to come to the laboratory and to imagine an important, meaningful place in their lives. We went through this whole kind of imagery induction, and we asked them to then repeat that. So to remember it once, report their emotions. They did it again, reported their emotions. In the control condition, they just imaged again and reported their emotions. In the experimental condition, the first 2 times looked just like the control condition, but in the last, we asked them to imagine they were in this special place, this meaningful place, for the last time. And what we saw is that we saw more mixed emotions, this poignancy condition, in that last time. Interestingly, positive emotions did not decline, but now there was also some sadness along with the positive emotions. So again, an example of mixed emotions that we think may be characterizing the kinds of experiences that older people have. We've studied advertisements and memory for advertisements of a different nature, because cognitive processing is not in humans something that happens in an even-handed way, but rather what we see, hear, and remember reflects the kinds of goals that we're pursuing in our lives. We show people advertisements like the one you're seeing here, an advertisement for a camera, in one that is featuring how that camera can help you explore, and in another, how to capture special moments. What we find is that older people remember the emotionally meaningful advertisements better, and the products they feature, by the way. Same thing for a watch ad. Success is within reach, don't let time pass you by, or take time for the ones you love, don't let time pass you by. We then began to investigate whether people are remembering all kinds of emotionally meaningful information more than neutral information, or if there might be something special about positive emotion. And over the years, we have shown in multiple studies that there is a relative preference in memory and attention. And there's evidence for this at the neural level, at the behavioral level, at the preference level, that older people are attending more and remembering positive information more than negative information. Meta-analysis of over 100 studies published a few years ago showed that this effect is reliable and robust. In our most recent work, we've been trying to see if we can take these kinds of findings and apply them in ways that could be useful to improve health. In one study with Nana Nofhoff, we recruited a group of older adults and randomly assigned them to one of 2 conditions. We wanted to increase the amount of walking that they did over a month-long period. In one group, we sent them messages every day, reminding them of the benefits of walking. In the other group, we sent them messages telling them about the risk of not walking, about sedentary behavior, and how that can hurt your health. We saw no increase in walking in the group that got the negative messages, but a significant increase in step count in that group that received the positive messages. And the last study that I'll leave you with is one that we recently published in Psychology and Aging. This was one where we were interested in financial incentives to increase walking, an important health behavior. And what we did was to assign people, young, middle-aged, and old, to different conditions. And one, they could earn money for themselves. In another, they could earn money for a loved one. In another, they could earn money for a charity. Younger and older people responded to the earning money for themselves more than any other condition. But older people responded to a charity condition. That is, when they could earn money to give to a charity, their step count increased. Younger people's did not, in this study, not a step, basically, but older people walked for a charity condition, and by the way, continued to walk in that condition, even after the financial incentives were removed. So to conclude, I think what we've learned are a couple things. One is that older people are less negative than younger people in their day-to-day lives, and more mixed in their emotional experience. If one asks the question, does aging affect emotion or aging affect suffering? I think you could say to the question, do older people disproportionately experience negative events in their lives that reduce or hurt emotional experience? And I would guess that the answer to that is yes. But if the question is, does age negatively affect the ability to experience positive times in life, then the answer is that aging may have actual benefits for emotional experience. I'm going to stop with a quote from a good friend of mine, Mark Friedman, who is trying to recruit older people to play important roles in society, in large part as a function of these kinds of emotional characteristics. What Mark Friedman says is that we cannot afford to waste the human capital represented in aging populations, and that older people may be the only natural resource on the planet that's actually growing. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is Vishwanath. I'm one of the co-directors. So Laura, you did a great job of really setting the table, so to speak, especially your ideas of social emotional selectivity and time horizons. I think those are really wonderful concepts. Particularly at a time, when we know that globally that, people are living longer, but it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about whether they're living healthier or not. And this is a global issue, I think, so not just for the US. In fact, as people have identified, it's just not high income countries, people are living longer even in low and middle income countries. So it's such a global problem. And you did a fabulous job of setting the table. I just want to introduce my co-moderator for the session, who will say a few words about, from her perspective, Dr. Lilian Cheung. Dr. Cheung is a lecturer in health communications and health promotions in the Department of Nutrition here at Harvard. And she has really taken a leadership role in communicating the importance of nutrition and mindful eating, and has worked very hard and consistently in the area of mindfulness, and has shown a great deal of interest. So she will say a few words just as a part of this opening remarks, and then I will introduce our two other panelists, Dr. Anthony Ong and Dr. Waldinger. So Lilian, do you want to say a few words?
Thank you, Vish and Laura, for inviting me to moderate in this important symposium. I'm really truly honored to be in the virtual company of world-renowned scientists, Dr. Carstensen, Dr. Waldinger, and Dr. Ong. And all over the world, many populations are living longer thanks to advances in medicine, lifestyle, healthcare, occupational and environmental practices, and nutrition. Indeed, there is now abundant scientific evidence that dietary factors can reduce the risk of cognitive decline, although it's unclear if these factors can have benefits once the decline becomes apparent. Furthermore, there is evidence, substantial evidence, that a healthy dietary pattern, such as the Mediterranean diet and other lifestyle habits, can promote healthy aging and improve life expectancy. Of course, we know all too well the numerous barriers to maintaining these healthy habits. Furthermore, COVID-19 health crisis has created a new range of challenges, including increased emotional distress. That said, it's been encouraging to see that the practice of mindfulness has become mainstream, and apply during these extraordinary times. For example, during his daily briefing this summer, Governor Andrew Cuomo urged all New York State residents to practice mindfulness using the Headspace app to help manage their stress. Recently, CNN's Anderson Cooper had a whole segment on meditation during his Full Circle program. So, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is living in the present moment with awareness and equanimity, with mental calmness and evenness of temper. Mindfulness is a state of clarity without constant mental reactions. And what's the relationship of mindfulness to happiness? According to the Buddha, who dedicated his life to finding the way to end suffering, mindfulness is a source of happiness and joy. I have been practicing mindfulness for over 20 years, studying with Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, a world-renowned Buddhist monk who was nominated by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967 for the Nobel Peace Prize for all he did to stop the Vietnam War. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh said. The seed of mindfulness is in each of us, but we usually forget to water it. If we know how to take refuge in our breath or in each step, then we can touch our seeds of peace and joy and allow them to manifest for our enjoyment. The practice of mindfulness fosters concentration, which in turn leads to insight. The insight we gain from mindfulness practice can liberate us from fear, anxiety, and anger, and allowing us to be truly happy. It is enlightening to hear Dr. Carstensen's observation that with age, we strive to live in the present moment, know what's important, and savor life. These are some of the key tenets of mindfulness practice. Since the year 2000, the science of mindfulness has flourished with over 6,000 scientific publications, indicating its benefits on numerous physiological effects, including reduced stress, improved management of chronic pain, reduced symptoms of anxiety and depression, and improved immune function. Will mindfulness improve the quality of life in older adults? It is another important consideration in the psychological realm. A 2019 paper published by a group of European scientists found that there is increasing evidence that mindfulness practice, such as meditation, promotes healthy aging across many dimensions, including emotions, cognition, and the preservation of related brain structures. This evidence is promising. However, more rigorous long-term randomized controlled trials are needed. And thank you for the time to express my comments.
Thank you, Lilian. And I think that is one of the more amenable psychological assets that you mentioned here, mindfulness. Thanks for those remarks and adding on to Dr. Carstensen's remarks. So without wasting any more time, I would like to move right away to the panelists. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Anthony Ong. He's a professor of human development at Cornell University, where he directs the human health labs. He has received a number of awards. I won't go through all of them from different professional associations for his work. He will be speaking next. After that, we will hear from Dr. Bob Waldinger, who is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and director of the Center for Psychodynamic Therapy and Research at Mass General. He has studied the lives of two groups of men for over 75 years, which has attracted a lot of attention, that cohort. and he will be able to talk to us about that. And then the questions are already flying in, so we will then open it up for questions after these two talks. So Dr. Ong?
Great. Can you see my slide? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to also say that I've been admitting people throughout this session, so maybe someone else can take over that role. Also, I want to apologize for the ambient noise. My neighbor has decided it's a good time to mow his lawn. So anyway, I apologize for that. So let me just say that I am really thrilled to be a part of this very august panel, and I want to thank the organizers and Laura Kobzanski. Let me begin by really just stating my goal for this talk, which is to try to do three things. First, I want to say a little bit about what it means to study happiness. And here I'm being a little provocative in using the term happiness. I want to be clear that I'm referring to positive affect, although in thinking about dynamic properties of well-being, one need not, in my opinion, be restricted to affect. So what does it mean when we say we want to understand happiness or positive affect? I want to suggest that to understand positive affect is to answer two puzzles of happiness. Does happiness change across the life course? And what distinguishes happy people from unhappy ones? The second thing I'd like to do is, after having outlined what it is that we understand about positive affect, I want to say a little bit about how I think this understanding is incomplete. And this will occupy the bulk of my talk, where I hope to show that human health and well-being involves more than merely experiencing high levels of positive affect and low levels of negative affect. And then finally, the third thing I want to try to do today is, after offering this analysis, I want to say what, in my opinion, follows from this observation, that in thinking about human health and well-being, one should also be thinking about how to best capture dynamic aspects of our emotional lives. So the analytic claims that I want to make can be summarized syllogistically. So one observes, for example, that there are individual differences in well-being. One further observes that emotions are important markers of well-being. One also observes that emotions are inherently dynamic. And both of these analytic points, what I'm calling here A2A and A2B, help to explain individual differences in well-being. And so I want to say, yes, 2A matters and 2B matters. And just to forecast my conclusion, I want to also argue that the conjunction of 2A and 2B matters. That is to say, I want to suggest that in considering what accounts for individual differences in well-being, we may do well to move beyond questions about whether positive affect is high or low to a consideration of the interplay between level and dynamics in positive affect and their relation to health. So first, let me say a little bit about how social scientists have come to understand positive affect. And here, as I suggested, researchers have thought about this in terms of two puzzles. The first puzzle is a longitudinal puzzle, a puzzle about how happiness changes over time. Having the unenviable task of following Laura, I thought I would share one of her slides. This is my way of paying homage to her. This is a slide, of course, it's meant to be a caricature, but I remember when I first saw Laura presenting this slide at a talk at USC, where I was a graduate student. This would have been 20 years ago. I remember thinking, you know, could this be true? Anyway, she went on to show, in fact, that this was true across many domains, but there was one domain in which this so-called misery myth, as she calls it, did not hold, and that was the domain of emotions. And I remember telling my advisor at the time, John Horn, that's what I want to study. I want to study emotion and aging. And of course, he was doing work on cognitive aging. And I told him, no, that's too depressing. I want to study emotional aging. Anyway, I never told her this, but I was moving, you know, in a certain direction, and I read her work, and it solidified things for me, and I saw a new possibility. And I want to thank her for that. For all the millennials out there listening to this, that's how it started, and this is how it's going. Here are data from 11 longitudinal studies comprising over 84,000 respondents spanning the ages of 11 to 106. And what you see here is the results of a coordinated analysis in which positive affect is best characterized by an inverted U-shaped trajectory, peaking in the mid to late 50s, as shown here in the black lines, which represent the meta-analytic trajectory. Negative affect, by comparison, is best described by a U-shaped curve bottoming out in the late 60s. These analyses, by the way, were conducted by Emily Bastarash, a former student who is now working with Dan Morozic. Okay, a second puzzle is what I'm calling the cross-sectional puzzle, and this has to do with the question of what distinguishes those who are high versus low in overall levels of positive affect. And there are many ways to show this, but one way is to show the disparity in mortality between happy and unhappy people. This is a meta-analysis of 62 studies with a pooled sample of over 1 million individuals conducted by Andrew Steptoe and colleagues. And what you see here, if you can make this out, is that most of these studies are to the left of 1, which is the hazard ratio, suggesting that positive affect and subjective well-being in general have a protective effect on mortality. Okay, so these briefly are just 2 puzzles that social scientists have tried to understand about positive affect. Let me transition now to the question of whether our understanding of well-being should involve more than a focus on overall levels of affect. And here I want to suggest to you that any serious conceptualization of well-being must take into account how our emotions fluctuate in daily life. Now, I was drawn into this question by a body of work suggesting that high levels of positive affect have a costly side. That is, they're associated with intense psychological distress, risky health behaviors, and even early mortality. And those of you who are interested, a lot of this work is summarized in a wonderful volume by June Gruber and Judy Moskowitz. So the question that's animated our thinking in this area is, given that high levels of positive affect have both been linked to favorable and unfavorable outcomes, what are the factors that contribute to whether positive affect is adaptive or maladaptive for health? One critical factor may be time. This is from Neelam Ram, and what I'm showing you here are the emotions of 150 adults assessed every day across 9 weeks. There's a lot going on in this spaghetti plot, but let me observe that one thing that might be going on when we look at this plot is the tacit assumption that these fluctuations are lawful in response to signaling events in our environment. To put it more philosophically, upon looking at this beautiful artwork that my friend Neelam Ram has produced, a moment's reflection would lead us to conclude that our emotions, our emotional lives, only have meaning to the extent that they change. And the question is this assumption true? This is a plot from a meta-analysis of 79 studies conducted by Hubin and colleagues. And what you can see here is that for each of these indices of affect dynamics, the majority of correlations with well-being are negative, suggesting that low psychological well-being tends to co-occur with more variable, unstable, and inert emotions. Now, I want to point out that the predictive utility of these so-called affect dynamic measures is a matter of ongoing debate among affective scientists. What I'm showing you here, for example, are zero-order associations, leaving open the question of whether these measures have explanatory power above and beyond more simpler indices like the mean. In fact, this is a question that was recently explored in a paper by the same group of researchers who analyzed affective time series data from 15 studies. And what they essentially find is that when you account for the mean in positive and negative affect, many of these relations between affect dynamics and psychological well-being go away. To put it differently, these dynamic measures could not beat the mean, so to speak. Now, one could argue that this is not surprising, that the best predictor of trait well-being is a measure of mean affect. This potential for measurement confounding is the problem of intra-category variability that Bruce Doenren identified many years ago. And so one may speculate, as the authors do in this paper, whether the problem of detecting unique relations between affect dynamics and well-being might be situated on the outcome side. So in collaboration with Andrew Steptoe, we recently had an opportunity to explore this question using experience sampling data that Andrew collected as part of the larger ELSA study. We examined the question of whether temporal fluctuations in positive affect were associated with mortality in older adults. So here we conceptualize positive affect dynamics using the mean squared successive differences, which essentially captures both variability and temporal dependency in the data. This table shows associations between positive affect instability as measured by the MSSD and mortality. And what you can see is that independent of the mean, which does appear in these data to have a protective effect on mortality, instability in positive affect is inversely associated with mortality. And this association persists even after accounting for a number of behavioral and health covariates. I should also say that these associations are also independent of mean negative affect as well as negative affect instability. And so at least in these data, we can say that we beat the mean, although I'm sure it will want a rematch soon. So I want to now turn to some other ways in which we have been thinking about affect dynamics. And here I want to talk about affective reactivity, which we've conceptualized as the magnitude of change in affect in response to daily events. So there's growing literature showing that heightened affective reactivity to daily stressors is associated with diminished eudaimonic well-being and increased risk of depressive symptoms, chronic health conditions, and even early mortality. And here we've been particularly interested in positive affective reactivity, where our work suggests that the problem is not so much whether you have or don't have high levels of positive affect. The problem is, how do you get your positive affect? And across a number of studies, we've shown that people whose day-to-day positive affect is contingent on external events are more likely to report poorer objective as well as subjective sleep, elevated levels of inflammation, particularly IL-6. And more recently, with my colleague Anthony Burrow, we find in a study of African-American adults that greater dampening of positive affect in response to daily racial discrimination is associated with more depressive symptoms a year later. Okay, I spent a lot of time talking about, the dark side, if you will, of positive emotions. And given that this is a panel about well-being and longevity, let me say something positive about affect dynamics. And here, we've been interested in the topic of diversity of emotional experience, particularly positive emotional experiences. You've made it when your work is featured on the pages of The Guardian, Good Housekeeping, and Tree Hugger in the same week. So this research draws from work in the natural sciences, or the benefits of biodiversity, or the relative abundance of different types of organisms within an ecosystem, which has been shown to promote ecosystem resilience. Drawing on this literature, biodiversity indices have recently been repurposed to quantify the variety and relative abundance of emotions that individuals experience. And although initial findings from several labs are promising, emo diversity has largely been studied using cross-sectional designs, and the focus of our work here has been to elaborate the utility of this construct using more intensive sampling data. So to visualize emo diversity, we use polar coordinate plots known as rose plots. Each slice or petal of the plot represents one type of emotion. What you're looking at here is the rose plots of 191 adults who were recruited as a part of a 30-day diary study. The emotions here, as you can see, are ordered in accordance with a circumplex. These plots, I should say, were put together by Libby Benson, a graduate student at Penn State. The colors represent the proportion of days each emotion was experienced with a certain level of intensity, ranging from blue, low intensity here, to pink, high intensity. And what you can see here looking across these plots is individuals differ in the intensities with which they experience various emotions across the study. To calculate emo diversity, we use Shannon's index, which quantifies the richness, in this case, how many specific emotions are experienced, and evenness, or the extent to which specific emotions are experienced in the same proportion. So just to get to the results, so we find in this study that after adjusting for mean levels of affect, emo diversity predicted greater levels of inflammation assessed as a latent construct. When we zoom in and look at the emotions separately by valence, we find that this association is driven largely by positive emo diversity. That is to say, people who report greater numbers of discrete positive emotional experiences with a fairly high level of intensity tend to be the ones who are benefiting vis-a-vis lower levels of inflammation. In more recent analysis using the MIDAS data, we find support for the notion that diversity in day-to-day positive emotions are in fact a source of resilience, buffering the effects of cumulative stress. This is an index that Natalie Slopin derived that assesses stress across 11 domains. So we find in these data that experiencing greater diversity in daily positive emotions attenuates the effects of cumulative stress on both depressive symptoms as measured by the CESD, as well as disturbances in sleep as measured by the PSQI, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. Okay, so just to sum up, I've suggested to you that well-being research has to a considerable extent focused on understanding two puzzles, a longitudinal puzzle and a cross-sectional puzzle. I further suggested that efforts to understand this puzzle has largely centered on average levels of well-being or positive affect. I've argued, however, that to understand well-being, one must take account of not only average scores, but also temporal fluctuations. So let me just close by saying a little bit about what I think follows from this argument and where we are going with this work. So if you accept this argument, if we can agree, if you can agree with me that the road to well-being is paved not only with average level data, but also individual temporal dynamics, then I think it's very difficult to argue that positive affect is a unidimensional label. Rather, in my view, the right argument is that a fuller accounting of what it means to be well necessitates that we move beyond whether positive affect is high or low to a consideration of the interplay between level and various forms of dynamics. Some of these dynamics I've talked about, but there are many of these, and in my view, the challenge before us is to map out the theoretical terrain by identifying other intrinsic properties of psychological processes along which individuals can be characterized. And finally, for those interested, we've tried to unpack this argument in greater detail in some recent writings. I see my time is up, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was very good. Let me welcome Dr. Bob Waldinger. And as he's coming in, I want to also say that please feel free to post your questions in the chat room. We are monitoring the questions, and at the end of Dr. Waldinger's talk, we will start asking the panelists some of these questions to the extent that we have the time. So Bob, welcome. Thanks. You're on mute, Bob.
Thank you, Vish. I just want to echo what people have said about what a wonderful group this is. And I was excited, Dr. Cheung, about your mindfulness description. We have just had accepted 2 different papers about mindfulness and their implications for health in late middle age. And so stay tuned. But let me first talk about how Dr. Carstensen's work essentially informed how the last 10 years of our research has gone. I do a longitudinal study. I'm the 4th director of a study that's in its 83rd year that started with 2 groups of men in 1938, gradually included their spouses and now their children. We're hoping to include their grandchildren. And so the men we started studying these people in adolescence. But by the time they got to well into aging, there was Dr. Carstensen's work on the positivity effect on socio-emotional selectivity theory. And it very much has informed how we have studied these people in later life. And also then Dr. Ong called out this whole issue of individual differences. And he's been talking with us about temporal differences. But we have been very much concerned with the issue of how we, let's see, am I advancing this? There, of essentially, why is it that some people age so differently than other people? That certainly there are times of the day where I feel more like the car on the left and times of the day where I feel more like the car on the right. But in addition, there are these ongoing individual differences that we notice in our participants, threads that travel through their entire lives and that we have begun to study. And so what I want to do is give you just a sliver of our research on one individual difference and how it shapes the experience of aging. Because as we know, responses to the challenges that aging brings to all of us run the gamut from avoidance to active coping and engagement of social supports. So for example, the same health challenge, hearing loss, could elicit support-seeking behaviors very adaptively in one octogenarian and might in another person provoke isolation, loneliness, depression. And these differences arise in part from how people resolve certain motivational tensions. And these tensions are relevant to us at all stages of our lives, but they are especially salient as we get older. So how do we preserve and develop new connections with people while we maintain a sense of independence and personal autonomy? How do we realistically accept the declines and limitations of aging while maintaining a positive appreciation for what we do better as older adults and a positive regard for the aging self that then motivates us to take care of ourselves? So what I want to do is offer just a bit of our research on this idea of security of attachment in late life as an example of how an individual characteristic can shape well-being and may account for some of these differences in how we age. So, the concept of attachment, as I think many of you know, is a concept initially that came out of ethology, out of animal development as well as psychological development. The idea that the human infant is in a state of dependence for a very long time, and that it is essential biologically to establish and maintain a connection with a caregiver, and that there are certain schemas that develop, certain patterns with which we maintain connections to other people that start developing before we develop language. These ideas were first put forward by John Bowlby, but then studied empirically by a host of investigators over the last 50 years. And so the theory is that we all have characteristic patterns of maintaining emotional security, that secure attachment involves eventually being confident that other people will be available when we need them, and comfort with depending on other people. But then there are people who develop schemas of anxious attachment, who are constantly preoccupied that other people may leave. And they're very, very alarmed when their needs are not met. And then there are people who develop what we call avoidant attachment, who appear not to care about relationships and appear to shun any depending on other people. But it's only appearance, because these, we think, are people who as children were taught by caregivers not to depend because it frightened the caregiver. So these ideas have been tested in many different ways empirically. And there's a lot of evidence that attachment style in adulthood is conditioned by prior experiences of closeness early in life. And there's a lot of evidence that attachment security or insecurity is a strong motivator throughout the life course for our behaviors. So who qualifies as an attachment figure? Well, as you know, it's not how many people you have as friends on Facebook. It's not even who is important to you in your life. Because if you think about it, many of us have young children in our lives who are very important to us, but they are not attachment figures. They are not the people who we are sure we can rely on. The best way to think about who an attachment figure is for you is to think about the question we asked our first generation participants at one point. Who would you call if you were sick or afraid in the middle of the night? Some of our people could make a whole list of names of people they could call, and some of our people didn't have anybody they could put on that list. Big individual differences. So let me just go through this model a bit. The model was begun looking at children, looking at infants. And we see that when a threat occurs, children alert. There is the attachment system, if you will, is activated. Am I going to be okay? Am I going to have what I need? And when the attachment system is activated, the infant protests. The infant seeks comfort and proximity from the caregiver. And when that happens, the infant returns to an equilibrium. Now, if we think about it, this sequence occurs at all times in life, but think about it in old age. Think about the health challenges that we face more and more as we age. That activates our sense of danger, of threat. That all kinds of interpretations are made, all kinds of behaviors are elicited based on how we feel about the availability of care and support. When we seek proximity and we find it, we return to equilibrium. I apologize, this was not the right photo of a man in a red convertible, but it's meant to convey a return to well-being. Okay, so what we see, and I see this in my clinical practice then as well as we see it in research, is that insecure attachment takes a particular kind of toll in older adults, that certain problems can be fueled by a fear that support is not going to be available. So that people may become more interpersonally difficult. They may have more interpersonal conflicts with the people around them when they feel their autonomy is threatened or when abandonment looks imminent. Also in couples, many people who are mismatched, one secure, one insecure, this can come to light and become more problematic if one partner's actual needs for care and support increase and the other partner is not prepared for that. Finally, as our social networks do narrow somewhat in later life, it may redirect our attachment needs that we used to get met with people at work and in the community, may direct it to one partner or one family member. And that family member may or may not be prepared to be the recipient of those requests. So, very little research, empirical research, has been done on late life attachment. And one of the things we know is that asking people how securely attached they are can be quite misleading, because people can say, oh yeah, I'm fine with depending on other people and I believe people will be there for me, and yet they may behave in an entirely different way. So we did a study of this with our older adults, and one of the ways that we studied this was to use an interview based on the adult attachment interview developed by Mary Main, but it was developed for couples by Judy Kroll, and we adapted it for adults in late life and asked them about caregiving, care seeking, how much they valued intimacy, dependence, independence. Now, the study was of 81 heterosexual couples. Now, Anthony just presented you a meta-analysis of 1.2 million people, so I present this sample size with great humility and a great deal of envy for other people's sample sizes. But these were a sample of couples. Men were close to 81 years old. Women were on average 76. Length of relationship was quite variable, but on average over 40 years. And what we found was that with rigorous, reliable coding, we could array people on a spectrum of security of attachment from most secure to most insecure. And what we found was that security of attachment was a strong correlate of concurrent well-being, of marital satisfaction for both men and women, but also of mood over 8 days in daily diary studies, and also in the frequency of disagreements. The couples where security of attachment was greatest had the fewest disagreements in their couples over that time. And for men, what we found, not so for women, but for men, that their reports of physical pain were significantly less over 8 days if they were more securely attached to their partner. So we went back to these same octogenarian couples 4 years later. We did a rigorous battery of neuropsych testing and some well-being measures as well. And what we found was that 4 years later, more secure attachment, 4 years earlier predicted greater satisfaction with life, 4 years down the road, less negative affect over the last 30 days, and less depression. All of these significant. And to our surprise and fascination, for women in this group, more secure attachment 4 years earlier predicted better working memory 4 years down the road. And what we found in addition was that secure attachment served as a buffer, that when we looked at how often these couples argued with each other, and some of them argued a lot, we found that the couples, the women who were more securely attached to their partners, had a buffering effect. The secure attachment buffered them from the effects of conflict on memory. Whereas the insecurely attached people who had more conflict had poorer memory 4 years down the road. So, just a couple of research questions that we have been examining as we go down the road, and then I will end. What are some of the challenges, the particular challenges that activate older adults' specific attachment and elicit the kind of maladaptive behavioral responses that we so hope to prevent and foster more well-being and more self-care? And are there particular windows of opportunity, for example, in midlife or in early retirement, where we can identify insecurely attached individuals and help them develop more adaptive strategies for aging? So with that, I will stop and we will, I guess, go on to our panel. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was very good, very nicely done. Just the audience, feel free to keep posting questions in the chat room. We already have some, so we'll ask as many as we can realistically in the next 10 minutes or so, 8 minutes or so. So these questions are for all the panelists. Anyone can jump in, you know. The talks focused on individual differences and on psychological assets and, you know, within that. So I want to get this question out of the way, so to speak. Maybe you can respond to this, maybe you can't, given you didn't study, but one question that has come up a couple of times is, what about the role of social determinants? Do they play a role in this? Whether it is race or class, or ethnicity or whatever it is. So that was not a complete focus of your presentations, but that keeps coming up, and I'm just curious what you want to say, what you can say about it. Anyone, Bob or Laura? Go ahead, Laura, or Anthony.
In our work, we see considerable consistency across socioeconomic level and ethnicity. We have focused most of our work on African Americans and European Americans, and we don't see differences there, except that African Americans on some measures show better well-being than whites. So we do see a little bit of that, but where we see differences, it's in that direction. But we don't see a lot. Now in our work also, we stratify by race, gender, socioeconomic status within age. And so that probably obscures some of these things as well.
Just curious, Laura, what explains that finding?
That we see the same effects? Well, I can give you one. I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that theoretically, our view from the perspective of socio-emotional selectivity theory is that whereas I would argue against universality for almost anything, recognizing mortality, the human ability to know that we are mortal, is universal. And so to the extent that time horizons are shifting our goals and how we focus on our lives, then I would expect to see broad generalizability.
Great, thank you. Bob.
I have a finding from our study about the social determinants of health that, you know, we started with a group of inner city Boston boys from the most impoverished and socially disadvantaged families, and then a group of Harvard undergraduates, quite advantaged and privileged. And what we found was that the inner city boys die on average 10 years earlier than the Harvard men. But of those inner city boys who went to and graduated from college, 25 of them out of 456, those men lived just as long on average as the Harvard men. Now that is a big cumulative measure of social disadvantage, and then some of the buffering effect of not just education, but all the social supports that go into bringing someone to the point where they can go to and stay in and graduate from college.
So from a causal direction point of view, it may be schooling, or it may be something else that's going on there.
Yeah, we think it has a lot to do, not so much with schooling, but with social supports. And then also perhaps with some greater awareness of, our increasing knowledge of health behaviors in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Mm-hmm. That the more educated men were sooner to adopt.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Anthony, do you want to weigh in, or?
Yeah, I mean, let me not answer that question and answer another question to be provocative, because let me say a little bit about what I perceive, I guess, in the question. Maybe it's me, maybe I'm being triggered as a psychologist. Sort of a ding against psychologists, and that is that to observe that there are individual differences in levels of positive affect, as I have, for example, justifies a kind of victim blaming argument, which says, in effect, if only you were happier, you would be better off. I know that no one is saying this, but one can sort of appreciate this critique. To which I would say this is kind of to commit a kind of a category mistake. Observing that there are individual differences in positive affect does not commit you to victim blaming. That is, to have argued, as I have, that individual differences in health can be explained by individual differences in level and dynamics and positive affect, actually just raises another question. What explains individual differences in levels and dynamics and positive affect? And there, I think there's a very long tradition in psychology and more broadly in the social sciences that offers some answers, some of which are to do with the social determinants of health. So I know I didn't answer the question, but I felt I had to get that off my chest.
Great. Get it off away. We are open to that. So thank you. That was very great. And there are a couple of questions that have come up on COVID-19. Obviously, this is it's one thing we can't ignore given everything that's going around us. I think, Laura, it was originally directed at you, though it will apply to both Bob and Anthony too. Is what could be the reasons for gain in positive emotions in this population when this population is much more at risk for COVID-19? So that was a question directed at you. Thank you.
Thanks. We looked at 19 different emotions, and some were positive and some were negative. And the emotions that account for this increase are calm, grateful, appreciative. So they aren't, again, happy like, oh, isn't this great, or but rather more emotions that I think of as kind of savoring emotions, appreciative emotions. And that's what we saw. That's, across the board, as we've been talking about different emotions, I think level of arousal is really important. And one of the things that we see in the literature is that you see more low arousal, positive emotions in older adults than in younger adults. And I think that's also part of this stability in emotion. and contributes to greater well-being.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if
Yeah,
I could
go
just
ahead.
follow up on that. The question being, how do positive emotions play a role in the current COVID situation? And I think, while our findings don't speak to the situation per se, I would say that, one way that researchers affective scientists interested in positive affect have looked at this is in relation to stress. So the role of positive emotions in stress is such that positive emotions are believed to buffer stress. In our work, in relation to affect dynamics, we find, as I've shared with you, that, and this sort of echoes with what Laura just said, that diversity in positive emotions, not just having, high levels of positive affect, it's the ability to maintain, in the context of stress, amid stress, a wide variety of different emotional experiences that may help people cope with stress. Now, I can talk about or speculate as to what's going on there, but just to point out that it's not just high levels of positive affect, but being able to maintain different kinds of happiness, if you will, amid stress.
If I may, there's one other thing I've noticed, which is that normalizing makes a big difference, so that people who can share the experience begin to feel less like outliers, and that increases a sense of well-being. In fact, some of my colleagues have been talking about our anxious patients feeling like, oh, now everybody's anxious and everybody understands what I've been going through. And that in many of these people, there is actually a kind of increase in the sense of well-being and a fellow feeling with the rest of the world.
Interesting. Thank you. Dr. Kuzansky, so do you, can I take one more question, or do you want to go for the five? Oh, Laura Kuzansky, I think so. You are on mute, Laura. So
I think somebody else, I'm not sure if it was Laura or Lilian, was trying to get in.
Lilian, were you trying to get in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. One more question,
Go
Laura.
ahead if you want to have one.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to ask you all about this. According to Dr. Alia Crum of Stanford University, mindsets are core assumptions about the nature and workings of aspects of the self and the world. Would our mindset about aging influence our well-being? I wonder.
If I may, Becca Levy would say absolutely yes. That the ways that one views aging itself and one's own aging affect how people experience it. And so if you think of aging as something that you can affect, that you can influence, people do better than when they feel that aging is something that will happen to them no matter what, and all they can do is cope.
I see.
Bob, you were vigorously shaking your head, so.
Yes, and I think because Laura, what you said about the sort of, we've been underestimating crystallized intelligence, and that there's a lot more now about wisdom, and that if people can, as we age, have a sense that, oh, there are real things that we can offer that younger people don't have to offer, including some of these forms of intelligence that are acquired through life experience, that's another way that our mindsets can shift, and in that way shift well-being.
Right. I agree with you so much. And I think, when I say, I think the misery myth may be the most pernicious of all myths about old age, because it does make you think that there's nothing you can do. And why would you plan for a stage in life and decide what you want to do and what your goals are and what you'll be better at if you think it's just going to be awful? And so I think it is exactly that. I think if people, to the extent that we can begin to come up with not a Pollyanna kind of, aging is saging, but a kind of things get better, things get worse. There are benefits and downsides to every age and stage of life, and begin to help people see what they may be, then I think we'll see people try to achieve those positive aspects.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
There is a question from the audience. When you said
the only reason I'm hesitating is we are running out of time. We are
okay. Laura, go ahead, Laura.
So we should let Dr. Kubzansky to jump
Yeah.
in, and offer her remarks.
Well, this is the problem of Zoom. If we were all in person, we could continue the conversation over drinks and canapes. So I'm sorry we can't do that. Can't send drinks to everybody. We're not allowed to do that, or chocolate, which would have been my preference. But in any case, I want to say thank you to our wonderful panel and our moderators for this really, really engaging and thought-provoking session. I always like this topic because I hope that it gives people sort of a fresh view on things that sometimes, don't get reviewed over time, and the notion that there are positive aspects to aging that are not just a Pollyanna kind of thing, and acknowledging that, saying things to people like, don't worry, be happy is not terrifically useful, I think is also really important. But recognizing sort of where the richness and the value of, having different perspectives on the world, I think is really important. And also the richness of emotional life and the diversity of emotions that people can experience over time, I think is really useful. We have this tendency to talk about happiness as if it's just kind of this monolithic, uniform concept. And what I hope today has helped people to see is that it's actually much richer than that, that if we're going to understand, people's emotional lives, we're going to have to take a much more nuanced view of these emotions. And, I thought the discussion about how do we understand people's well-being, not taking a nosedive during COVID was a really important one, which is to say we can't just look at, happiness as a kind of singular construct. We have to understand that, there's all this other rich emotional life that people have going forward. And I also think that this research points to some really important ideas about interventions, or if we understand why it is that older people maybe are able to regulate emotions a little bit more effectively, are there strategies that we can teach our younger people to kind of help sort of take on those emotional regulation strategies a little sooner in life so they could get the benefit of them. And I think this does lead to a whole variety of really interesting questions about sort of interventions and education and ways of thinking about how we could improve population health overall. So I hope this has given people a lot of different ideas and food for thought, ranging from, the linkages from this symposium to the last one, which is talking about the importance of social relationships, which is a social asset, to your emotional life and your emotional health, which is sort of a individual asset. So I think there's lots of linkages between these factors. They don't, exist kind of in isolation, and we often speak about them singularly, but I hope that people will see the connections between them. And I also hope that it reminds people that even in times of real challenge, there are opportunities and ways to view the world in a more positive light, which I know, I find very reassuring when it seems like there's more dark than light that's outside. And I also think that as a population we'll benefit from remembering that it's not only about sort of trying to take away the problems, but it's also about trying to add the resources. How do we help people sort of leverage some of this understanding and knowledge to take up these resources that might help people to function better? So all of this, I think, leads to some really exciting opportunities for both research, translation, and so forth. And we, of course, at the center are hoping to be involved with that. As you know, this is the final day of the 2-day symposium. If you missed day one, the recording is available on our website. We will also have a recording of today's program as well. We are hosting a whole series of public events like this one. We have our monthly seminar series, which is actually focused on health equity and positive well-being. We got into just a little taste of that discussion today, but we'll have much more coming. Our next seminar is December 2nd with Dr. Cheryl Giscombe, who's from UNC Chapel Hill. If you're interested in these events, please subscribe to our mailing list to get updates about them, or you can check our website. There are links in the chat box for folks who want to go do that now. And follow us on social media. We would love to be followed: Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for instant and regular updates about our programming and research. I also want to just mention again our very Sincere gratitude to the Lee family for their support in establishing the center and for their continued interest in our work and the commitment to understanding health and happiness globally. And also to thank the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies. And just generally, I want to say we're really excited to see the research that's emerging from all of these important investigators, from our panel speakers and our keynote, to give us a better understanding of population health. I think this work is so important. It's often harder to get it funded because people think problems are more important, so they're less likely to put funding into sort of understanding how to make things go well. So we're very grateful to the researchers who have actually persisted in making this work a priority. We do see this work as providing insight into ways that we can create conditions for promoting resilience and thriving even in times of great challenge. So we thank all of you for joining us, and we hope that we'll see you again at our next seminar on December 2nd, and that you will take advantage of the resources that we have on our website. And hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.